Thank you for coming along to my talk tonight. There were a range of titles I was considering for this. One is Islam in Britain, Islamophobia, the Muslim civil rights crisis. I try to put, I hope, a more positive spin on things, because I think these are things which we can overcome and a challenge which we can find a way through. It's difficult to start a talk this evening without considering something that happened during the week, which of course is the resignation of the Pope. I do an awful lot of interfaith work, and it's something that I've been mucking around with on Twitter, trying to be respectful. If there's anyone live tweeting, I'm at Mo Ansar. So if you copy me in, I'll retweet you afterwards. I was reminded about a story I heard about a Trappist monk who, before he became a monk, when he joined the monastery, he was told that part of his conditions of being there were that he would, every 5 years, he'd be allowed to say 3 words. And for the first 5 years, he worked diligently and worshipfully and in piety. And after 5 years, he said, need new shoes. And of course, the abbot brought him some new shoes. And another 5 years passed, and he continued in silence diligently. And after 5 years, he said, need new mattress. And of course, the abbot bought him a new bed and tried to make these more comfortable for him. Another 5 years passed, and the Trappist monk then turned to the abbot and said, I'm quitting. And the abbot turned around and said, well, it's probably for the best. You've done nothing but moan since you got here. I reflected on what it meant for the Pope to have stood down so soon, and the first for, let's say, 600 years. But it was interesting, because it also made me think about this issue around finding your voice, and it's something that largely the Muslim communities have for the longest while in the West, and particularly in Britain, struggled with. By the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I was very fortunate. I went to a reasonably good secondary school, a grammar school, considered to be one of the best in the country. And when I was at that school, we were told that Columbus was looking for India. We were told that he bumped into America. We were told he discovered it and called it the West Indies. We were told that everything before this time, before this had happened, was known as the pre-Columbian era, a period of barbarity, a lack of civilization, essentially no civilization at all. Now, there is also a Muslim account of this story. And so, for a bit, we will venture into a brief history lesson, some facts, a love story of sorts, for you ladies, and chaps like love stories too, and some myth. In the 9th century, during the rule of the Spanish Muslim Caliph Abdullah ibn Muhammad, a Muslim navigator known as Kashkash ibn Sa'id ibn Aswad from Cordoba in Delva in Palos in Spain, crossed the Atlantic in 889, reaching something called Ard Majhula, which are the unknown territories, and he returned with fabulous treasures. This is recorded in a book written by al-Masudi in 943 called Muruj al-Dahab wa Madin al-Johar, which the meadows of gold and the quarries of jewels. It's sometimes just called meadows of gold. Now, Muslim navigators at that time regularly came into contact with the Rus, which were considered Norsemen, or what we would consider to be Vikings. One of Kashkash's contemporaries would have been a famous Muslim chronicler called Ibn Fadlan, who is a faqih, and that's not a derogatory term. It means he's a jurist. And he wrote a 9th century letter, which we call a risala, and it's a phenomenally rich account. He talks about the fauna and the peoples and the places he goes to and what he sees. And it's an unparalleled kept journal. And it details his encounters with the Rus all along the Volga, as well as with many other people. The Muslim historian Abu Bakr ibn Umar al-Qutiyya narrates that during the reign of Muslim Caliph of Spain, Hisham II, another Muslim navigator, Ibn Farouk of Granada, sailed in February of 999 from Kadesh, which is about 15 miles southwest of Homs in Syria. And he sailed into the Atlantic, landing in Gando, which is Great Canary Islands. He visits the king, he continues westward, he names a couple of islands, and he arrives back in Spain in May 999. There really is no shortage of evidence to show that these Muslims were in fact trailblazers, pioneering in Islamic geography, travel and navigation. Leo Weiner from Harvard University confirmed in his book in 1920, called Africa and the Discovery of America, that for centuries, pre-Columbian West Africans spread throughout the Caribbean, through Central, South, and North American territories, including Canada, where they were trading and intermarrying with the Iroquois and the Algonquin Indians. In fact, it turns out that Muslims were navigating, trading, intermarrying, mingling, peacefully integrating with Native American tribes some 5 centuries, 500 years before Columbus ever set foot in the Americas. And so what of Columbus? We know his brother was a cartographer in Muslim Spain, and so we come on to the bit about a love story and a myth. The Caliph at the time, Caliph Abdullah, was renowned for having an incredibly beautiful daughter, his princess, which is recorded in Western books as Bob Dylan, which isn't to be confused with Bob Dylan, who is somebody completely different. Bob Dylan, we take, would have come from and been extracted from Ibn Abdullah or something of the like. In fact, she fell in love with Columbus, it said, and Columbus fell in love with her. And like many fathers who was concerned about marrying his daughter off to a European or somebody from a different tribe or culture or tradition, he did what some would have done. He sent her packing. So he shipped her off to the Caribbean. And love-struck, forlorn, heartbroken, Columbus then decides he needs to chase after Bob Dylan and tries to pursue her. But every door he knocks on, everyone he goes to with a begging bowl, nobody will sponsor him because he needs a ship, he needs a crew, and he needs money. And here the myth ends, and the harsh reality begins. Because at that time, the European royal families had a plan to get Muslims, not only Muslims, also Jews, out of Europe, in a plan called the Reconquista, which was essentially the reconquering of Europe. And this timing was a stroke of luck, serendipitous for Columbus. He secures a payment from Ferdinand and Isabella, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, who are leading the Reconquista on behalf of the European royal families. And he sets sail to the Americas on condition, essentially, that he take a fleet there, and he goes there on what we would now call a crusade. And so in 1492, chasing after this princess that he has fallen in love with, he sets sail to the west, to the Caribbean and to the Americas. Now, it's important to note here that it's probably unimaginable to think that European forces didn't know what they were doing, where they were going, and to whom they were going to do whatever it was they were about to do. Effectively, there were motorways going from the west coast of Africa and from Europe to the Americas, and Muslims had been trading along these navigational pathways for centuries. So this was no mistake. It didn't turn up by accident. We know the Great Crusade to the west, to the Americas, led to the genocide of the people out there, to their history. And the rebuilding of the modern America, and we'll come back to the America at the end, will be built upon the blood of countless West African slaves taken from Muslim lands. Merely 3 generations earlier, they were leading the world in thought, science, discovery, and travelling to the Americas to trade and coexist in peace and prosperity and harmony. But religious freedom in the West, and in Europe in particular, has an ugly history. The European royal families made an agreement 60 years after Columbus, and once the Muslims had been ejected from Europe. They call that the Peace of Augsburg Agreement. And it provided essentially that each province or each waliya could have freedom of religion, as long as those religious choices were Catholic Christianity, Lutheran Christianity, or Calvinist Christianity. Now, 100 years later, this agreement was confirmed in the Treaty of Westphalia, that Europe is essentially a Christian club. And we begin to see that religious intolerance is nothing new in Europe. When we look at the treatment of Jewry in Europe, we see something very striking and something very similar. Professor David J. Wasserstein from Vanderbilt University in America says, Islam saved Jewry. By the 4th century, we saw Jews converting to Christianity in significant numbers in Europe. Rome had reduced the status of the Jews, and they were unable to fulfill their religious obligations. By 570, Jews and Judaism were, according to Wasserstein, on their way to oblivion, cultural oblivion. They had lost Hebrew, they had lost access to Aramaic, and as a result had lost access to the Torah, their poetry, and their liturgy. And the rise of Islam had a huge effect on Jews at that time. Within 100 years of the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him, North Africa was conquered, and almost all of Jewry came under the rule of Islam. The legal, religious, demographic, social, political and cultural condition of Jewry all improved. By 900, Jewish culture was flourishing. Speaking almost entirely Arabic, Hebrew was revived, and the works of Ibn Ezra, Gaon, Ibn Gabriel, Maimonides, and others were aplenty. Islamic societies at that time were open, and no significant restriction was placed on the practice of Judaism. And we see a very clear line and distinction between the treatment of Jews in the Islamic world and Western Christendom, or Western Europe, at that time. Western European intolerance for the treatment, Western European tolerance for Jews predated Muslim involvement and protection for the Jews. This intolerance repeated and escalated after the Reconquista. And without the protection which is woven into the DNA of Islam, Jews faced, again, expulsions, persecutions, pogroms, and of course the horrors of the Holocaust. Edmund Burke said, "Those who don't know history are destined to repeat it." Now, aside from the fact that Burke was the founding father of modern conservatism, going back to the mid-1700s, he had not only read the Quran, but he attested to the value of the Sharia and its unmatched emphasis on justice. Today, despite decades of learning built around an increasingly mixed religious and cultural heritage, amidst a millennia of engagement, involvement and close contact, we find that a YouGov survey recently stated that 74% of the British public claim they know nothing or next to nothing about Islam. And furthermore, 64% of those that claim they do say they do solely based on the knowledge they acquire from the media. Now, accompanying this profound and humanitarian educational gap is a deeper and, I would say, arguably more significant issue. Its importance lies in the fact that it asks the question of who we are as a society and the path we wish to take in the future. It's now a matter beyond a point of denial that Muslims living in Britain are the most discriminated of all social groups and classes in the country. It's a state of affairs and a mistreatment which is now at epidemic levels. Islamophobia is the prejudice against, the dread, hatred or irrational fear of Islam, and by extension, the fear and dislike of all or most Muslims. It includes the perception that Islam has no values in common with other cultures, is inferior to the West, and is a violent political ideology. The seminal 1997 report by the Runnymede Trust also refers to the practice of discriminating against Muslims by exclusion from economic, social and public life of the nation. Thankfully, I say thankfully, Islamophobia has now finally become internationally recognised amongst governments, scholars, academics and activists as a form of intolerance akin to anti-Semitism. Now there are 5 key myths and 3 key behaviours which make up Islamophobia, and it's worth taking a moment just to highlight them. So of these 5 key myths, the first is that Islam or Muslims are immovable. We are a gigantic monolithic block unresponsive to change. Secondly, separation. That we are the other. We're without values in common with other cultures. We're neither affected by them, nor are we influenced or do we influence them. Inferiority. Compared to the West, Islam or Muslims are considered barbaric, irrational, primitive, or sexist. Violence. Aggressive, threatening, supportive of terrorism, and engaged in a clash of civilizations. 5th, political. Islam is an ideology used for political or military advantage. And the 3 recognizable Islamophobic behaviors. Silencing. Criticisms made by Muslims of the West are rejected out of hand, even though they may be well-founded. Hostility. Negativity towards Islam is used to justify discriminatory practices towards Muslims and the exclusion of Muslims from mainstream society. And normalizing. That anti-Muslim hostility is seen as natural, normal, and in some places, even recommended. Now, over the last decade, anti-Muslim discourse has become increasingly seen as respectable. In February 2011, Baroness Saeed Abbasi gave a speech at Leicester University where she talked in detail about how Islamophobia had passed the dinner table test. And it's true, hostility towards Islam and Muslims has become accepted as normal, especially within the UK. Academics are now openly commenting on the similarities between Islamophobic discourse and European pre-Nazi anti-Semitism. Cora Doving from the Norwegian Centre for the Studies of Holocaust and Religious Minorities outlines 10 rhetorical arguments. I won't go through all of them, but I'll highlight a few of them. One is the takeover, that there are minorities overrunning Western countries. There are international underground networks, high birth rates, and somehow we will act as a 5th column in these societies. That there are institutions at risk, that Western society, such as the church, the family, the monarchy, secularization, freedom of the individual, gender equality within the family, that somehow all of these are perceived to be in an immediate danger of subversion by Muslim and Islam. The next one's very interesting, considering the attacks by Anders Breivik a couple of years ago, which is that these are all being facilitated by the naive left. Anders Breivik at that time, what did he attack? He attacked a Labour Party camp, a youth camp, where young people between the age of 16 and 25 who were promoting agendas which include tolerance and multiculturalism, he considered to be opening the door to the Islamification of Europe. Hate commanded by God, that minority religions, Islam particularly, are claimed to be exclusionist and inherently political. And the treatment of women and children, that our children's education is somehow unimportant. When I say our, I speak as a Muslim. And women are portrayed as passive passengers who cannot think for themselves. Well, for any of you who know Muslim women, you will know they are utterly, utterly fierce. That is very, very far from the truth. Most worrying of all, I guess, is the idea that... Don't start hitting each other. Most worrying of all is the idea that something must be done. That something must be done. Regaining control to pass laws that limit freedoms of specific groups, and often paradoxically, while claiming to maintain Western liberties and freedoms. Now, this rhetoric can often be harmless and the preserve of academics and commentators. But when this narrative ties together with the reality on the ground of alienation, marginalisation, discrimination, and physical attack, then we face a broader societal problem and something significantly more serious. The reality of Islamophobia and anti-Muslim prejudice has now resulted in a tangible civil rights crisis for Muslim communities, not only within the UK, but in many countries within the Western world. In the UK, the largest and oldest Muslim communities are those settled from Pakistan, India and Bangladesh, and their British-born children and grandchildren. And almost 80% of these households are now on or below the poverty line, compared to 1 in 5 of white British households. Muslims consistently face higher levels of unfair treatment than other religious groups generally, and certainly face more unfair treatment in all aspects of services provided by local government. That's the finding of a report by the Department of Communities and Local Government. And you might say, well, that's no surprise considering September the 11th. You might say that's no surprise considering the attacks of 7/7. But this was done almost a year before 9/11. White European converts, white European Muslim converts, get more mistreatment and prejudice proportionately than Muslims from other ethnic backgrounds. When it comes to education, Muslims perform less well in schools. 1/3 of all British Muslims of working age have no qualifications. No qualifications. And young Muslims are more likely to be unemployed than any other group. On leaving school, they're more vulnerable to job losses and cuts to services. And a report backed by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation states there is now record levels of discrimination against Muslims in employment. The unemployment rate for the British Muslim is approaching 20% compared to the 8% national average. An often quoted Islamophobic statement, repeated by certain right-wing politicians and media commentators, reads along the lines of, all Muslims may not be terrorists, but all terrorists are Muslims. Well, that may be right when we call Anders Breivik an extremist, or a serial killer, or any other word other than terrorist. But in reality, we know that the real picture is quite different. Europol surveys state 99.6% of terrorism in Europe is not committed by Muslims. Now, I had the pleasure of hearing Baroness Vasi speak recently about the role of the media in stoking the flames of Islamophobia. And while some polls state that 99% of all media reports on Islam and Muslims are negative or overwhelmingly negative. Now, bear in mind that the Europol surveys state that Muslims are not doing 99% of the terrorism, However, 99% of the time they talk about you, they're talking about you in negative or overwhelmingly negative terms. Unitists actually went even further in their criticism. And I'll quote them. The predominant narratives about Muslims in our media are overwhelmingly negative, inaccurate and racist, but also that this has had a devastating social impact, undermining community cohesion and contributing to a dramatic rise in anti-Muslim hate crimes. Now, even 100 years ago, De Lacy O'Leary stated, history makes it clear, however, that the legend of fanatical Muslims sweeping through the world and forcing Islam at the point of a sword upon conquered races is one of the most fantastically absurd myths that historians have ever repeated. This Islamophobic rhetoric isn't new. Nandy's research at the University of Essex shows Muslims are more proud to be British citizens than the general public. And they feel they belong in Britain slightly even more than British Christians do. Now, these views need to be contrasted with those of British non-Muslims, which shine a very definitive light on what is at the heart of the matter. The following makes for uncomfortable, but perhaps arguably not unsurprising reading. Only 1 in 4 Britons believe Muslims want to integrate into British society. Around half of Britons see Muslims as a threat. They believe Muslims create problems and admit thinking there are too many Muslims in Britain and would be concerned if a mosque was built in their area. Roughly half for those individual 5 questions. And almost 6 out of 10 associate Islam with extremism. Attacks on Muslims, violence, street crime, and the increase in the far-right movements, both in the UK and across Europe, combined with an economic depression, the likes of which we have not seen since the 1930s, are chilling echoes, re-emerging from a dark chapter in European history. Tell Mama are a UK organisation which records and tackles Islamophobia, hate speech, and Islamophobic action. And they report that around 600 Islamophobic incidents have taken place since March 2012. 2 out of every 3 victims is a woman. 2 out of every 3 perpetrators is male. More than half of all cases are linked to perpetrators who are EDL sympathisers. So what do we have? Young, white, British, EDL supporters or sympathisers attacking Muslim women. How very brave indeed. Now, one of the most obvious things we could say to try and do to rectify this is to focus on education. We re-educate the children, regardless of whether we win or lose the current battle on Islamophobia. We can secure the future by securing a higher and a better level of understanding and education. We can talk about the contribution of Muslims and Islam and move away from the language of integration. And government, politicians and academics are working together and have worked together on an all-party parliamentary group on Islamophobia and education to do precisely this. But sadly, the recent refocusing of core learning announced by the Education Secretary means that some of the curricula which I have seen as an educationalist are now once again excising and censoring the contribution of Islam and Muslims from education. And I consider that to be a deeply worrying and retrograde step. It's been a long-held tradition in the West that links to classicism and that which is Aristotelian have enjoyed an embellishment, whilst the natural and arguably closer links to scientia and a near-Islamic history are almost always completely unrecognised. As the Cambridge theologian and historian Tim Winter states, Islam was for much of its history the principal heir of Hellenism, geographically and intellectually. The Muslims are the heir to the Roman Empire, is what he says. And I think it's time we openly, publicly recognise the debt to Islam in world history and the foundation of European Enlightenment, the Renaissance and our modern contemporary society. However, we continue to feed a perception gap where adults cannot help but see Muslims and Islam as the other, as described by Edward Said. And more recently by the Christian theologian, and I'm very happy to say my friend, Brian McLaren, who says there's nothing more undermining to a people than to start counting from 2 when you're looking at their history. Europe, and indeed Western civilization, owes a huge debt of honour to Muslims and to an Islam which we have all but lost. The unmatched contribution to science, philosophy, mathematics, algebra, chemistry, physics, geography, navigation, medicine, scientific research and discovery, pharmacy, cartography, and much more besides. But the question is, where is this now? Some of those particular advances and pioneering works were done in the realm of critical thinking and of humanism. Muslims were the pioneers of humanism in Western Europe and pierced the spear of intolerance from Western Christendom, which said there was no knowledge outside of Christianity. But I have to say, Muslims have largely become their own worst enemies. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "The best of all dealings is the one which is moderate." And so who has the Islamic reference? Where are the enlightened and the tolerant? Where is this progressive, forward-thinking and inclusive Islam? And while struggling and debating the matter of reference, of the Islamic reference, we are causing separations within ourselves and between us and other faith groups and a secular society. Many fail to engage at the real heart of society, to work on the real levers of power and to deliver thought leadership. Academics such as Briffold say that Europe owes everything of its progress to the golden age of Islam. In fact, Islam is very much intrinsically European and Western. But Muslims too may now, I hope, have much to be thankful for the West. When the West was in darkness, illumination came from the Muslim world. Quite literally. If you went to Andalusia at that time, you would have arrived at a city, the biggest city in the world at that time, of 1 million people. A city which had streetlights. The only place you would have found streetlights. You would have seen flushing toilets. You would have seen running water and fountains in the desert. And had you arrived there from any other city in Europe, you would have thought yourself landed in paradise. And unbeknown to the West, while the Muslim world over the last 200 years has found itself in a state of disrepair, not entirely of their own making, the West has kept that flame, that illumination burning bright. And now perhaps it's time for that light to be reclaimed by Muslims. Reclaim it, share it, and democratize it. You, the next generation of leaders and thinkers, and particularly those of you who are Muslim, as the next generation of leaders and thinkers, you're a guiding light in society. And so your responsibility is to light the way. You, must do it with love, tolerance, and enlightenment. You cannot water down your deen, your system of beliefs, but yet you cannot also offend others. The Prophet did not come but to perfect our manners. And at a time when society needs moral guidance and a shining light, we have this. We are precisely what is needed. And your time is now. And you now are part of this movement. And this is why your time is now. I think the world is in desperate need of a healing, of a new way of thinking and of doing things. Saving from ourselves our own worst desires and our own worst instincts. For the first time in 500 years, South Americans are defining their own paths and reawakening their own traditions and beliefs, their spirit. For the first time in 100 years, Muslims in the Middle East are turning to Islam and not Western liberalism or secular democracies for guidance. The contribution of Muslim scholars and academics, imams, sheikhs and activists has largely been censored from books from which you have been learning from, and that fact is a crime against humanity. Remember, it's also been censored from the books everyone else learns from. And so you need to define a new Islamic identity, one not of integration but of contribution, one of thought leadership, of social justice and learning. We cannot pull up the ladder after we have climbed it. The inequality gap is going to open up further than ever before. And whilst the rich are getting incredibly rich, the gap with the poor is opening. And amongst the poorest in society, the gap between them is opening up even further, as black and ethnic minorities are becoming increasingly set adrift. And who are the worst amongst those? It's the Muslims. But this can, and inevitably will, change. As George Monbiot writes, changes over the last 5 years have seen the single biggest shift in wealth from the poorest in society to the richest, through stealth changes to corporation tax. The poorest in society are being squeezed. They're paying a greater burden of taxation than the richest in society. Over £1.5 trillion of our money has been given to the banks to bail them out from their gambling debts and corrupt practices. And it doesn't stop there, it's a blank cheque. There's more to come. I was sneered at cynically a couple of years ago when I wrote an article and came on television to talk about the ethnic cleansing of our streets, which we are now seeing as local authorities are told to put caps on housing benefits, which are forcing out ethnic minority and Muslim families from inner city, high-price areas and leafy suburbs into the new urban ghettos of the next decades. And this moral vacuum and social decline is everywhere. It's all around us. We are seeing the Americanization of our society, the privatization and commercialization of huge swathes. And so what of the US? Well, in the US we saw the impossible come true. A black American man become president. In the land of slavery, Jim Crow, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, we saw a black president. Whilst Obama and the UN last year spoke of peace, freedom, security and justice, I wonder how many actually know the man behind brand Obama. How many know that he worked for Business International Corporation, a known CIA front, before joining the government? How many know that he repealed more gun control laws in the first 2 years of his presidency than George W. Bush did in 2 whole terms? How many knows that he strengthened and extended the scope of the Patriot Act, one of the most heinous pieces of legislation ever known? How many knows he removed the civil liberties of people not only in America, but elsewhere? He's refused to close Guantanamo Bay, and in the middle of a recession, with so many homeless, jobless and penniless, Obama increased the military budget. And what about this Americanization? What about this model we are inheriting as a 51st state of the US? In the US, 44% of all children live on low incomes. 15 million live in poverty. almost 40 million regularly use food banks. The US has 90 firearms per 100 people, a higher rate of ownership than any nation on the planet. The US ranks 23rd out of 34 in work-life balance of all developed nations. The US has overthrown governments of 72 nations since World War II. In the US, a woman is raped every 42 seconds, according to the Department of Justice. In the US, the only G20 nation refusing to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women. And as John Pilger, the award-winning Australian journalist, reminds us, now America is building new tactical weapons to blur the line between nuclear and conventional war. In fact, the US is the most socially immobile country on the planet. Nowhere is the American dream more impossible than in America. We need to think about what messages we are being sold and what the realities are, something I often term HD thinking. We have commercialised and farmed out degrees for the wealthy, for those willing to pay the price. British children must be taught about Islam's influence on history, the influence on enlightenment, John Locke, the Declaration of Independence, Smith, economics. It cannot be that the contribution of Islam and of Muslims is simply erased from history and children grow up seeing Islam as the other. I'm a Muslim. Hath not a Muslim eyes? Hath not a Muslim hands, organs, dimensions, senses, affections and passions? We are fed with the same food and hurt with the same weapons. We are subject to the same diseases and healed by the same means. We are warmed and cooled by the same winter and summer. If you prick us, do we not bleed? And if you tickle us, do we not laugh? If you poison us, do we not die? And what then if you wrong us? Racism and hatred is the fuel nations burn to feed the machinery of foreign invasion and war. But all of this must and will at some time come to an end. In the meanwhile, we move away from the talk of integration and move to talking about contribution. We need to move away from the old dialogue and into a new sphere of thinking and engagement. 50 years ago this year, on the 16th of April, Martin Luther King Jr., in his letter from a Birmingham jail, wrote, "We will have to repent in this generation, not merely for the hateful words and actions of the bad people, but for the appalling silence of the good people." It's time to step up, to shake off the shackles of silence and speak up, be involved. Do not hide behind a veil of hard thinking or worse, hard hearts. Real freedom is never given easily by those who oppress. It must be demanded by those who are oppressed. And for Muslims, we can never do this by transgressing the limits of manners, tolerance and Islam. And so we, actually you, have a grave responsibility, because it's going to be up to you, all of you, to change this. Thank you for listening tonight. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.